When you're in trouble, when the odds are stacked against you, the smart thing is to ask for help. You want the truth to make sure your power doesn't erode any further, and that's why Anthony Blinken is on a mission of salvation for the United States, and his adventures have brought him to China. Now, this is a historic meeting, but not really for the reasons that we think. The rivalry between the United States and China is so deep, they'll take more than one meeting to really solve it. But of course, we have President Biden hyping up the trip as a massive success. According to him, US-China relations are now on the right track and progress has been made. He also praised Blinken, saying that he did one hell of a job in Beijing. Yes, some progress was made indeed. More communication is definitely better than less, but don't get it twisted. Nothing fundamentally has changed. There's been no major breakthroughs. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a very direct and harsh message for Blinken. He mentioned how Washington should stop hyping the China threat theory, lift sanctions on China, and stop suppressing their tech sector. So if there's really any real progress on US-China relations, we need to see America stop treating China like the boogeyman. They also need to stop the sanctions because sanctions always backfire, right? They don't work and most definitely not against China. However, something has shifted. At least in the meeting, the United States has dropped the aggressive tone towards China, especially over the Taiwan issue. And this is good because we know Taiwan is a clear red line for China. The moment you cross that boundary, you're almost guaranteed a conflict. Now, America has reaffirmed that they won't cross the line, they are committed to the One China policy, and it's a promise that hopefully the United States can keep. And this is what Blinken said. We do not support Taiwan independence. We remain opposed to any unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. We continue to expect peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences. And this is very important and perhaps the only tangible progress I can see from this meeting. America is taking a step back because there's really no point in trying to compete with China. The United States is being stretched thin with the Ukraine war. There's the banking crisis, it likely isn't over yet, and a recession is just around the corner. So they just don't have the bandwidth to add in a conflict with China into the mix. Now let's get to the juicy part, which is Anthony Blinken's meeting with President Xi, because it wasn't even supposed to happen. It wasn't scheduled and the meeting was essentially a surprise. Now there's a concept in China called giving face or saving face, and that's where you give due respect to the individual, and in this case, China was giving face to Anthony Blinken with a meeting with President Xi so that he looks good on the world stage. In essence, China helped the United States preserve its prestige and not look silly. And that is the nuance of communication, especially with the Chinese. So at least on this point, China is coming to the table in good faith. But if you want to see who's really in charge of the meeting, we just need to look at a picture of Blinken greeting Xi because it's a really bizarre shot. Now, Blinken looks like a student who won a scholarship. He's walking up to take his award from the school principal. Then in this next shot, Blinken looks very uncomfortable and worried. He seems very confused. So the optics here are very weird. You can kind of tell that Blinken is on a back foot. He wants this interaction to go well. He has to bring home good news to Biden. Now, China, on the other hand, is in full control of the agenda, and they didn't hesitate to set the tone of the meeting. President Xi told Blinken that state-to-state interactions should always be based on mutual respect and sincerity. I hope that Secretary Blinken, through this visit, could make a positive contribution to stabilizing China-US relations. So even after all the provocations and all the saber rattling, China is looking to pursue peace with the United States, and Xi reflects that in his statement. And this is where the rubber meets the road. China has laid out their terms and conditions to the US, which you must admit is quite fair. It's all about minding your own business and fair competition. According to Xi, China respects the interests of the United States and will not challenge or replace the United States. Similarly, the United States must also respect China and not harm China's legitimate rights and interests. And here's the finisher, neither party can shape the other according to its own wishes. I think it's crystal clear what China expects and is willing to concede. So if America wants to remain the hegemon of the world, by all means, I don't believe China wants to have hundreds of military bases scattered around the globe, right? I also don't think they want to completely replace the dollar as the world reserve currency. It's just too much of a burden. Now, what China wants to do is to grow their own economy, keep trading with the United States, and to be left alone. That's the key thing, to be left alone. Your problems are yours, my problems are mine, let's leave it there. So if the United States is really sincere about this, they have to drop all the rhetoric about containing China. We just need to recall Biden's investment curbs to China with the G7 backing, right? The US is planning to curb investments into China's tech sector, which is a form of economic containment. Trying to decouple isn't going to fly Beijing anymore. And I want us to pay attention to one key part in Blinken's speech that tells us that the United States is also aware that decoupling with China isn't a good idea. Our countries traded more over the last year, in fact, more than ever over the last year, nearly $700 billion. And as Secretary Yellen testified before Congress last week, it would be disastrous for us to decouple and stop all trade and investment with China. However, China has very serious doubts about America's intention, especially when it comes to the idea of de-risking. And this is what China's foreign ministry is pushing back on, questioning if de-risking is just a repackaging of decoupling. That is the legitimate question that I'm not sure America can give an answer to just yet. I don't think America and China should ever decouple, right? The pain isn't worth it, and the whole world will plunge into inflation hell if they do. However, we need to understand why the US is suddenly interested in normalizing relations today, right? Is it a coincidence? Because obviously, they want to prevent extreme escalation. It doesn't benefit the United States, it doesn't benefit China. And a big reason why Blinken flew to Beijing is because the US is losing a lot of influence in the world today, especially in the Middle East. And let's recall what happened when Blinken visited Saudi Arabia, right? He had a meeting with MBS and they discussed everything, including human rights. And the next thing we knew, Saudi companies signed $10 billion in deals during the Arab-China summit. So that was a big fail. We also mustn't forget the two refinery deals that Saudi Aramco also signed with China. They are going to ship an additional 700,000 barrels of crude a day, which strengthens China's energy security even further. If the US keeps losing the support of the Middle East, this is going to be disastrous, especially for the dollar. And if we focus on the African continent, America's also losing economic influence in that region as well. We can see China's trade with Africa outpacing the US almost 4 to 1. 166 billion from the Chinese versus only 48 billion from the Americans. So based on pure economic power, the US is lagging behind. But what's more concerning is the perception of America's global influence by their own people. Putting up a report by the Pew Research Center, far more Americans see US influence on the world stage getting weaker than stronger. The results are rather shocking. According to the survey, 47% of domestic Americans find US global influence getting weaker. You compare that with only 19% saying it's getting stronger, and you have a real problem on your hands. Everyday Americans can see the slow burn, the slow erosion of America's standing on the world stage, and they are very concerned about it. And this is terrible news, and to restore confidence, the US has to normalize relations with China. They don't have any other choice. Because if the US refuses to cooperate with Beijing, the next hit on the chopping block is going to be the US dollar. And we know the events that led to today's de-dollarization trend, don't we? The endless borrowing from the US government, as well as weaponizing the dollar to punish Russia. Now we can debate which is worse, but the end result is still the same. Let's listen to what Putin said about financial sanctions during his address at the St. Petersburg Forum. By weaponizing the dollar, they are undermining their own influence, including in international finance. They are compromising the reliability of the American currency, both as a payment instrument in international trade and as a form of savings a reserve currency. And this means if America keeps using the dollar to hammer people, countries will be afraid of it for trade and bank reserves. They'll diversify away and engage in more bilateral trade. Even Janet Yellen can't deny the trend of countries moving away from the dollar. In a recent testimony to Congress, she admitted the obvious. We should expect over time a gradual increased share of other assets in reserve holdings of countries, a natural desire to diversify. So if Yellen knows this, I'm sure Blinken is also aware of this fact. Normalizing relations with China is also a strategy to slow down the pace of de-dollarization. And if China keeps trading with the US and relations are somewhat restored, that means trust in US treasuries won't suddenly crash. China will keep rolling their dollars into US bonds, which keep borrowing costs in the US low. It keeps it down. At least that's the hope, right? And another big nightmare the US has is the rising influence of the BRICS bloc. And I think it's becoming very apparent the threat a united BRICS represents, especially to the reserve currency. Now, I want us to look at BRICS as a big de-dollarization club, right? The bigger it grows, the greater the network effect, and the greater the network effect, the more effective and appealing bilateral trade outside the dollar really becomes. And pulling up the story from Bloomberg, BRICS strive to counter US with expansion, shared currency. The bloc's ministers meet in Cape Town as nations line up to join. What I want us to focus on is the expansion of the BRICS countries. BRICS might soon become BRICS Plus. And looking at the world map, we can see a bunch of countries really interested to join, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The bigger the membership of BRICS, the higher the odds of bilateral trade outside of the dollar. This is important because members can now access key resources without relying on the West. You can get oil from Saudi Arabia, commodities from Russia, and consumer goods from China or India. And what America is trying to do is to broker peace with China. Because if relations normalize, then faith in the dollar will be restored, at least in the short term. And if that isn't enough to convince you, then consider this shocking report that's circulating around. It's a clear indication that America's alliances might not be that rock solid after all. According to French media, Macron, the president of France, is hoping for an invitation to the upcoming BRICS summit in South Africa, and this is unprecedented. Just the optics alone is enough to keep Joe Biden and his staffers up at night. France, a G7 nation, a NATO member, attending a summit with Russia and China, that is mind-blowing, guys. It tells us that countries are recognizing the economic power of the BRICS bloc, and they want a piece of it. They are not about containing China. In fact, they want to trade more with Beijing. And in the past, countries all wanted to hate West, right? But things are changing. They now see BRICS as the place to go if you want to grow your economy. And if you compare the GDP of the G7 versus BRICS in 2020, the bloc has already surpassed the West. And what's more shocking is the trajectory of the growth. One line is going up, while the other is crashing down. So 5 or 10 years down the road, BRICS is going to dominate global trade, and this can unlock so many possibilities that the US is really afraid of. For one, we could have a common currency coming out to trade within the bloc, or the Saudis could start pricing oil outside of the dollar, which could just break the petrodollar system. And if you think the G7 unity is rock solid, we need to think again. Every country today is out to secure their own best interests, and it doesn't matter which group they belong to. Pulling up a story from the Wall Street Journal, Japan breaks with US allies, buying Russian oil at prices above the cap. And because of their energy needs, Japan broke ranks with the rest of the G7 to buy Russian oil. Now, sure, they had the blessing of America for the purchase, but this exception tells us quite a few things. Sanctions never work, and those who control the supply of energy controls the economy. So if BRICS Plus gets bigger with Saudi Arabia and the UAE joining, then we could see more energy trade begin outside of the dollar. And this isn't good news for the reserve currency because it reduces the incentive to hold dollars and then roll them over into US treasuries. And if countries start to buy commodities using their own local currency, then they'll naturally hold fewer dollars in their reserves. And looking at the dollar usage of the reserve currency, it has been losing market share over the past 2 decades. It has gone from 72% during the early 2000s to 58% in 2022. And that's a 14% drop in 20 odd years. And why is this happening? Because even if you take away the threat of sanctions, countries are vulnerable to US monetary policy. Every time the Federal Reserve hikes interest rates, it causes a rush to dollars that breaks the economies of emerging markets. And if commodity producers start accepting other currency for things like oil and gas, the financial order will change. Countries won't need to rush for dollars to secure their imports anymore. So if you're America, it makes total sense, right, for your economy to make peace with China. It doesn't help your economy and it doesn't help the dollar to keep butting heads with the Chinese. So I want to emphasize that things are at least moving in the right direction. Xi told Blinken very good that progress was made, and hopefully we get Biden and Xi speaking again, so the ball is in America's court. But I have bad news. Things just went downhill again after Biden's remarks about President Xi. In a story by Reuters, Biden calls Chinese President Xi a dictator. He made that remark during a fundraiser in California after Blinken's trip. And it's so bizarre that you can't make this stuff up. It was about the Chinese balloon once again and how it went off course. That's a great embarrassment for dictators when they didn't know what happened. That wasn't supposed to be going where it was blown off course. Now, this is a very bad look. When you're trying to normalize relations, Once again, it goes back to the Chinese concept of giving face. Due respect has to be given at the highest level if real progress is to be made. Now, I'm still hopeful for a breakthrough. This is a good step, much better than another escalation, but some things are just not going to change. We are moving towards a multipolar world that I'm 100% sure of. Countries are still going to de-dollarize and diversify away, and the global financial system is going to fracture even further into East versus West. So the best we can hope for, guys, is economic competition between the United States and China without any hot war, a controlled rivalry that doesn't escalate any further. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Was Blinken's trip a big success or fail? Can America save the dollar? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.